When people talk about the most haunted houses in history, the infamous Enfield Poltergeist often tops the list. I never thought I'd find myself recounting such a tale, let alone one I had a direct connection to. But this story isn't just about the paranormal. It's about how reality can blur in the presence of something inexplicable. And yes, it's based on true events. It all started in 1977, when my Aunt Peggy moved into a modest council house in Enfield, a suburban neighborhood in North London. She was a single mother, raising her 4 kids: Margaret, Janet, Johnny, and Billy. The house was nothing extraordinary. Red brick, small garden, a typical post-war residence. But what none of us knew at the time was that it would soon become one of the most infamous haunted houses in history. I was 17 at the time and lived nearby, so I often visited my cousins. I was close to Janet, who was 11, and Margaret, who was 13. They were bright, lively kids, always up to something. But in the months following their move to Enfield, something changed in that house, and in them. It started innocently enough. One evening, while helping Aunt Peggy with some chores, Janet complained about a strange knocking sound. She thought it was coming from the walls of her bedroom. At first, Peggy brushed it off as the pipes or the creaking of an old house settling into its foundation. But as the days passed, the knocking became more deliberate, more intelligent. I remember one particular evening when I was visiting. Janet and Margaret were playing a board game in the living room while I chatted with Peggy in the kitchen. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by the girls' panicked screams. We rushed to find them standing in the hallway, their faces pale as sheets. "The dresser moved," Janet cried. "It slid across the floor by itself." We tried to calm them down, reasoning that perhaps they'd bumped it or it was a trick of the mind. But when we went into their room, the sight chilled me to my core. The dresser, a heavy oak piece of furniture, had been dragged nearly 3 feet from the wall. There were no scratch marks, no signs of how it could have moved. The girls were too small to push it themselves, and Peggy swore she hadn't touched it. That night, I left the house feeling uneasy. The air inside seemed thicker, heavier, as though something unseen was watching us. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of strange occurrences. Toys would fly across rooms without warning. Chairs would tip over on their own. Lights flickered even when there were no electrical issues. But the most terrifying moments always involved Janet. One evening, Peggy called me in a panic. When I arrived, she was standing in the hallway clutching her rosary. Janet had been screaming uncontrollably, claiming that someone, or something, was pulling at her bedsheets. When I went to check on her, she was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "Something's in here," she whispered, clutching a teddy bear to her chest. "It's angry." I didn't know what to say. How do you comfort a child when you're just as scared as they are? A few nights later, I decided to stay over, thinking my presence might bring some comfort. That night, I slept in the living room while Peggy and the kids stayed upstairs. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. Not mine, not human. It was guttural, almost animalistic, and it was coming from the corner of the room. I sat up, my heart pounding. The breathing stopped, but then a chair across the room slid toward me, screeching against the wooden floor. I didn't stay in that house again for weeks. By this point, the entire family was on edge. Peggy reached out to a local priest, who came to bless the house. For a few days, things seemed to quiet down. But then it returned, worse than ever. The entity began speaking. It started as faint whispers, unintelligible mutterings in the dead of night. Then, one evening, as we all sat in the living room, a deep, gravelly voice came from nowhere. "This is my house," it growled. We froze, every muscle in our bodies paralyzed by fear. Peggy clutched her children tightly, her eyes darting around the room. "Who are you?" she managed to ask. The voice didn't respond. Instead, a framed picture flew off the wall and shattered on the floor. Word spread quickly about the haunting. Journalists, paranormal investigators, and curious neighbors began flocking to the house. Among them were Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, 2 members of the Society for Psychical Research. They were skeptical at first, but quickly realized this was no ordinary case. Maurice, a kind and methodical man, spent weeks documenting the events. He recorded knocking sounds, objects moving, and even the disembodied voice, which claimed to belong to a man named Bill Wilkins. According to the voice, Bill had died in the house years ago, and he wasn't ready to leave. As the investigations continued, the activity seemed to target Janet more aggressively. She would wake up with scratches on her arms, bruises on her legs. Sometimes she would be found in a trance-like state, her voice changing into something guttural and unnatural. One terrifying night, I witnessed something I still can't fully explain. Janet was sitting in the kitchen, drawing quietly, when suddenly her chair lifted off the ground. She screamed as it tipped backward, throwing her to the floor. Before I could reach her, she was dragged across the room by an unseen force. It took both Maurice and me to pull her free. The priests who visited the house began to suspect that this wasn't just a haunting, it was something darker, something demonic. With all the attention, the Enfield house became a media circus. Some called it a hoax, accusing the family of faking the events for publicity. But I knew the truth. I'd seen too much, felt too much to ever believe this was anything other than real. Still, the skepticism weighed heavily on Peggy and the kids. They felt isolated, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. But as the investigators continued their work, they discovered something that sent shivers down my spine. Bill Wilkins was real. Records showed that he had indeed died in the house, suffering a brain hemorrhage while sitting in his favorite chair. The chair, the very same one that had moved toward me that first night. When the truth about Bill Wilkins emerged, the haunting at the Enfield house took a darker and more sinister turn. Knowing that the disembodied voice belonged to a real person who had once lived and died, there sent chills down my spine. But this wasn't just about Bill anymore. It felt like something far more malicious had latched onto the family, using his name as a mask. Janet became the epicenter of the activity. It wasn't just about objects moving or strange noises anymore. Her behavior began to change in ways none of us could explain. Sometimes she would stare into empty corners of the room, her face pale, her lips moving as though she were in conversation with someone. Other times she'd have violent outbursts, screaming words that didn't sound like her own. One night, Maurice Gross set up a tape recorder to capture evidence. Janet had been complaining of hearing Bill's voice in her head. "He won't leave me alone," she said, her voice trembling. Maurice, always gentle, asked her to repeat what she was hearing. At first, nothing happened. Janet sat silently, staring at the floor. Then, without warning, her head snapped up, and a guttural voice emerged, not her own, but deep and gravelly, like an old man's. "I'm Bill Wilkins," the voice growled. "I died in this house. I'm not leaving." The room fell into stunned silence. Maurice, trying to remain calm, asked a series of questions. Each time, the voice responded with eerie precision. When he asked how Bill had died, the voice replied, "I had a hemorrhage. I fell asleep in the chair and never woke up." It was undeniable. This wasn't just a child's imagination. Something had taken hold of Janet. The recordings were sent to experts for analysis, but no one could explain how an 11-year-old girl could produce such a voice. The tapes made headlines, drawing more attention to the Enfield house. The media frenzy brought skeptics and believers alike. Some accused Janet of being a fraud, but those who spent time in the house knew better. I remember one night vividly. I had come over to help Peggy keep the kids calm. The house felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very air was weighed down by an unseen presence. At around midnight, we heard a loud crash from upstairs. Rushing to Janet's room, we found her bed levitating several inches off the ground. She was curled up on the mattress, sobbing. "Make it stop," she cried. As we watched in horror, the bed suddenly dropped with a deafening thud. The room went cold, and a deep, raspy laugh echoed around us. But there was no one there. The priests who had blessed the house returned, this time armed with holy water and prayers, meant to banish whatever was tormenting the family. But their efforts only seemed to anger the entity. During one of the blessings, a crucifix was ripped from the wall and hurled across the room, shattering on impact. One of the priests suggested that we dig deeper into the history of the house. Maybe there was more to the story than Bill Wilkins. What we found was horrifying. Before Bill, another family had lived there, a mother, father, and their young daughter. The father had a reputation for violence, and neighbors whispered that he had dabbled in occult practices. One night, after a heated argument, he had reportedly taken his own life in the very room where Janet now slept. The daughter had also suffered a tragic fate, disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Her body was never found. It began to make sense. This wasn't just Bill Wilkins. The house itself seemed to be a magnet for darkness, feeding off the pain and suffering of its occupants. As the weeks turned into months, Janet's condition worsened. She would go into trances, her eyes rolling back into her head, her voice changing as the entity spoke through her. Sometimes she would levitate, her body contorting in unnatural ways. Once I saw her rise several feet off the ground, her limbs jerking as though invisible strings were pulling her. Maurice and Guy were at a loss. They called in additional experts, mediums, psychologists, even paranormal researchers from the United States. But no one could agree on what was happening. Some believed Janet was possessed, while others thought she was being manipulated by a poltergeist. One evening, Maurice conducted a séance, hoping to communicate directly with the entity. We sat around the dining table, candles flickering in the dim light. Janet was in the center, her head bowed. Maurice began speaking softly, calling out to the spirit. At first, there was silence. Then the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. The candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Janet suddenly lifted her head, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "They're all here," she said, her voice a chilling blend of childlike innocence and something far darker. "They're watching." The family reached their breaking point when Janet went missing for several hours. We found her in the upstairs closet, curled into a ball, her arms covered in scratches that looked like writing. The words were hard to make out, but one stood out clearly: mine. Peggy decided she couldn't take it anymore. She called the church again, begging for an exorcism. This time they sent a team of priests who performed a rigorous cleansing ritual. For hours they prayed, chanted, and sprinkled holy water throughout the house. Janet screamed and thrashed, her voice shifting between her own and that of the entity. Finally, as dawn broke, the house fell silent. For the first time in months, the oppressive weight lifted. The priests declared the exorcism a success, but warned that the family should move out to avoid a resurgence of the activity. Peggy took their advice. Within weeks, the family left Enfield, moving into a smaller home in a different part of town. Janet's condition improved, though she remained quiet and withdrawn for years. She later claimed to have no memory of many of the events, though the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. As for the house on Green Street, it stands to this day, an unassuming structure that holds dark secrets within its walls. Neighbors still report strange occurrences, knocking sounds, cold spots, and shadows moving where none should be. And as for me, I'll never forget what I saw in that house. It changed the way I see the world and what might exist beyond it. Leaving the house on Green Street felt like a relief for the Hodgson family and for me, as someone who had been deeply involved in their ordeal. However, as anyone who's dealt with something truly sinister will tell you, escaping the location doesn't always mean escaping the haunting. In the new house, things were quieter at first. Janet's demeanor improved, and for the first time in months, the family seemed to be getting some rest. But the scars from Green Street ran deep. Janet would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, claiming she felt something watching her. Drawers would sometimes open on their own, and small items would move from their places. Peggy brushed it off as residual trauma, but deep down we all knew the truth. Whatever plagued them hadn't been fully eradicated, it had followed them. One night, while visiting the Hodgsons, I witnessed something that confirmed our worst fears. Janet had been doing better, even laughing a little during dinner, but later that evening, as we all sat in the living room watching TV, the air grew icy cold. Janet suddenly froze, her eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. "There's something there," she whispered. We all turned, but there was nothing, at first. Then, out of the shadows, a faint figure began to emerge. It wasn't the full form of a person, but a distorted, shifting mass with glowing eyes. The entity was back, and this time it wasn't hiding. The lights flickered, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the room. Peggy grabbed the children and backed away, but Janet remained rooted to her spot, her face pale and her lips trembling. "It's him," she said. "He never left." After that night, it was clear that the haunting hadn't been confined to Green Street. It had latched onto Janet, feeding off her fear and vulnerability. Peggy, desperate for answers, reached out to anyone who could help. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair returned, but they admitted that their efforts might not be enough. "You need to sever the connection," Maurice told Peggy. "Whatever this is, it's bound to Janet." But how do you sever a connection with something you can't even understand? The church was contacted again, and a decision was made to attempt a full exorcism, not just of the house, but of Janet herself. The exorcism was set for a cold, rainy evening. The priest arrived, accompanied by Maurice, Guy, and a small team of assistants. Janet sat in the middle of the room, trembling but resolute. Peggy and I stood nearby, holding hands and praying silently. As the priest began the ritual, the air in the room grew thick and oppressive. Janet screamed as the entity made its presence known. Furniture shook violently, and windows rattled as though a storm was raging inside the house. The shadow appeared again, more solid than ever before, its glowing eyes fixed on Janet. "She's mine," the guttural voice roared. "You can't take her." The priest didn't falter. He continued chanting, sprinkling holy water and holding the crucifix high. Janet convulsed, her body writhing as though she were being pulled in different directions. At one point, the shadow lunged toward the priest, but it seemed to hit an invisible barrier and recoiled with a deafening screech. The air crackled with energy, and the candles in the room flared brightly before extinguishing all at once. Then, with one final, earth-shaking roar, the shadow dissolved into nothingness. The room fell silent. Janet collapsed into Peggy's arms, sobbing. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house was still. The exorcism seemed to work. From that night on, the activity stopped. Janet slowly began to recover, though she would later describe feeling a faint presence lingering around her, as though the entity had left a piece of itself behind. The family finally found some peace, but the events left an indelible mark on all of us. Maurice and Guy documented the case extensively, and it became one of the most famous hauntings in history. Skeptics continued to question the validity of the events, but for those of us who lived through it, there was no doubt. The Enfield Poltergeist was real. Looking back, I often wonder what drew the entity to Janet in the first place. Was it her vulnerability? Her innocence? Or was it simply the nature of the house on Green Street, a place where pain and despair seemed to accumulate like a dark cloud? Whatever the reason, the experience changed me forever. I learned that there are forces in this world that defy explanation, forces that thrive in the shadows and feed on our fear. But I also learned that courage, love, and faith can stand against even the darkest of evils. To this day, I still think about the Hoggisons and what they endured. Their story is a reminder that the supernatural isn't just a thing of folklore or horror movies, it's real, and it's closer than we think. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.